Welcome to the Student Hub Live event for the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. Today we're going to be talking about some of the research that the faculty do, and we're going to look at a variety of themes including belonging, technology, inequality and heritage of war. Now, this is a live online interactive event, and you're either watching it live in the studio today or on catch-up. And we're streaming from Milton Keynes here in the studio. You're probably at home, and you'll see some chat boxes that you can fill in and let us know what you're doing, which subjects you're studying, and more importantly, what you think of the topics that we're discussing today. Now, you may have questions to pose to our guests in the studio, and we will feed those into our discussion because HJ and Damon are on our hot desk, and they'll be chatting to you at home as you're watching and also letting us know what you think. So welcome. How is everyone out there?
We're doing okay, all ready to go, aren't we, in the chat, which is fantastic. And we always say in the chat, anything goes. So any thoughts, comments or questions, I know our fantastic guests would love to hear from you as well. And if there's anything you need help with, just let us know, any technical issues. And if there is something that you want to just email us, you don't want to put in the chat, just email us, studenthub@open.ac.uk. And we've got our board behind us where this morning people have been sending in wonderful pictures of study buddies. We have got a rabbit up there, a few dogs and mostly cats. They like to keep us company while we're going through our studies journey. So if there's anything you want to send in to us, or if you want to show us the view from where you are, if it's lovely and sunny, unlike here, you can also email a picture to us, studenthub@open.ac.uk, and you just need to let us know it's okay to use the photo and it's yours as well. But all ready and raring to go.
Yep.
And Damon, you're a tutor and you also work in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences.
Yeah, that's right. I tutor on TD 223, which is second level international development, and I work in the deanery in the faculty. So as I say, fabulous stuff going on today. Some really good, interesting things, mixing together some subjects that you wouldn't ordinarily think would work together, but they do. They do.
Absolutely. No, thank you. So in our programme today, we, as Damon says, have a very wide mixture of guests. And we're taking a real interdisciplinary approach to look at some of the key topics that are really, really important right now. We're going to take a look at belonging, inequality, technology and how that's impacting on our lives, and the divide between man and machine, and heritage of war. So we've got 4 really meaty discussions that we're going to approach from a range of different disciplinary perspectives. In our first session, we're going to look at belonging with Graham Harvey, who's in the studio with me now, Stephanie Taylor and Georgina Blakeley. But before that, I'm going to show you a video from John Allen, because one of the things that we're going to talk about today is how important research is in terms of the things that we eventually teach. So how do all of these research grants get completed? How do people look at the world around them, generate new knowledge, and then ultimately develop that into teaching that people will read about at the Open University? So to discuss the link and relationship between research and teaching, we have a video now from John Allen about that, and then we will start our first session, which is about belonging.
My name's John Allen. I'm Professor of Economic Geography in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. I've been researching and teaching at the OU for the best part of 40 years. And research is in my blood. It's part of my DNA, like any other academic. What research allows is for fresh thinking, so that you're setting agendas. You're not simply reflecting your subject, you're actively trying to extend it. Let me give an example of that. I work on power and geography and how power works at a distance. How it is that central governments, for example, or corporations, can reach into people's lives and shape it and control them. Thinking about borders recently, I was also struck by something, this often happens, something happens in the news. A curiosity takes you certain places. So in this case, it was the now defunct British political consulting firm, Cambridge Analytica. And they hit the news because they were micro-targeting individuals, trying to reach into their lives to politically manipulate them. And I was thinking, how does that political manipulation actually work? How does that control work, say, in relation to migrants' lives? And I was thinking of Theresa May, the Prime Minister's hostile environment, and the way in which control works through academics like myself, through banks, through landlords, to actually control, not so much control, but track migrants' legality or their legal presence in this country. So it's that idea of reaching into people's lives, how that actually works. So if I say something like the state reaches into your lives, people know exactly what that means, but it's not always clear how one spells that out in research terms. So I wrote a paper on borders and control and manipulation of people's lives, reach, for a geography journal recently with a colleague. And I was trying to set the agenda around that notion of geographical reach and power. Now that's something that hadn't been done in my area before, but I don't teach that. That's something that I'm trying to set an agenda for my particular area. It allows me to engage with the body of work that's already out there around migration and borders and power, but I'm trying to extend it. When it comes to teaching, I still teach power, but I translate my ideas, my research, into teaching. I don't just do my research and simply put it into the teaching. What I do is, as I say, and I stress, I translate my ideas. Let me give an example of that. On a first level foundation course, DD 102, I wrote a chapter on power in supermarkets, really about how Tesco, or not so much how, but whether Tesco dominates the high street or not. And I was less interested in supermarkets because I don't do research on supermarkets, but it's an interesting topic, a familiar topic. It's like a hook for people for students to grab hold of. And I was trying to teach whether the big four supermarkets, Tesco, Sainsbury's, etc., actually dominate the high street or simply allow others to come into the high street, other small shopkeepers. So it's a question of what I was trying to get across was whether it's a zero-sum game or a positive-sum game. That's what I'm trying to teach. Zero-sum game simply means that when Tesco's arrive in the high street, all the other shopkeepers lose out. I win, you lose. Zero-sum game. Positive-sum game means that when Tesco's come into the high street, they increase the number of people who come into the area, the footfall, and everyone gains. Now, I wasn't teaching one or the other, teaching it as a debate. But my research on power and geography has nothing to do with zero-sum games or positive-sum games, or supermarkets for that matter. I know very little about supermarkets other than the scholarship I did, because the scholarship itself is me keeping abreast of what's happening around supermarkets and whether Tesco have a monopoly in an area and what monopoly means in that area, which is 25% of the market. None of that is my research. My research is around power and geography, manipulation, inducement, seduction. Those kinds of ideas I have to have a broad sense of, and I want to, as I say, change an area, set an agenda in my research. But I need to have that broad sense of my field to be able to translate it into a much more familiar area that works better through teaching. So the two go together, but they're very different activities. The different research opens up new questions in teaching. It's not necessarily the same as the research itself. The two go together, but they're separate and different.
In this section, we take a look at the topic of belonging. Now, everybody seems to belong somewhere. We often ask, where are you from, as much as we ask what you do. And in this sense, where you work or study might even be some kind of belonging. But it's really topical because right now in this era where migration, refugee crisis, nationalism and globalisation, belonging in one sense or another is a really important theme in the media, social media, academic research and everyday conversations. And in this discussion, we're going to take an interdisciplinary look at this topic with Georgina Blakeley from politics, Stephanie Taylor from social psychology and Graham Harvey from religious studies. Now, such a big topic. I wonder, Stephanie, if we might take a social psychology perspective, because obviously belonging is intrinsic to the way that you look at the world.
Yes, I mean, there are different ways of approaching belonging. We could call those different research paradigms. But I think we can start off with the point that it's an incredibly important topic because it links to so many other things, to our ideas about home, to the way people tell their life stories and so on. And it's not just a sort of matter of intellectual ideas, although the ideas around it are extremely interesting, and there are many different ones, which is what interests me, the multiple meanings. But as I say, it's not just a sort of thinking exercise, it's also about feelings. all the ideas around belonging are what I would call affect laden. They are loaded with an emotional charge. And if you think of a question like somebody saying, where do you belong, or why do you think you belong here, or saying to somebody you don't belong, or this isn't your home anymore, you can see how incredibly powerful these things are. So what interests me about it, and what interests social psychologists, is that you have on the one hand a set of ideas that come from society, from the past, from art, from images, you know, the image of, say, the typical sort of person standing on the shore who is the person who belongs in this place. You've got those kind of shared ideas from society, but they link in to the extremely personal experience of who you are and the way you think about yourself, and very, very deep feelings. And so that's been the area that's kind of focused my research on it, taking it more specifically into research about people's life stories, but also moving outwards from that. I am generally interested in that zone, if you like, of where the social meets the individual and the personal, and how that in turn makes us who we are. It shapes our ideas about the shape of our lives, the shape that our lives should take. You know, so many people, for example, have this image that when they get older, they should go back to where they belong, however they think of that. So many complex ideas around it, but incredibly interesting, I think.
But you're like motivated from a very personal perspective as well, because of your sort of relationship with where you belong.
Well, yes, because I come from New Zealand and I've lived here for 40 years, and I can generally get through about a half a day without somebody asking me something about my accent and saying, why are you here? And then, are you going back? Whereas in New Zealand, they just say, you know, British, aren't you? But I think it's definitely sharpened my awareness of these issues. And although my personal situation is not, touch wood, linked to sort of tragedy or exclusion, you started off mentioning the big topics. John Allen was talking about control, about the power implications of research. Every discussion about something like immigration rules, immigration laws, the status of children, the status of people for purposes of working and studying, all of those come back to some sort of taken for granted ideas about belonging. And my interest is in unraveling those ideas and teasing out their implications. We can do it, as I say, in personal terms, but we're always coming back to not just sort of a rather nice, you know, idea of do you belong here or there, but to very hard-edged issues of who's not allowed, you know, big political things, which I know is Georgina's interest.
Yeah, we've asked people at home some questions as well, and I'd be really grateful if you could fill those out. So we've got a multiple choice widget. In your experience, belonging or not belonging is about a place, a memory, other people, or something else. We're also going to talk, as Stephanie mentioned, about democracy with Georgina, who gets to decide in democracy, and 3 names or places or communities that you're proud to belong to. So if you could fill those in for us, we'll integrate those into the programme. And with the word clouds, if you can only think of 1 or 2 things to write in those boxes, just put a full stop in, otherwise your results won't submit in there. So it's really interesting. You're talking about your sort of personal perspective, and also the sense that I guess within social psychology, everything is so situated and contextualised. And it's really interesting seeing, which we'll talk about further, how we're all driven to particular research areas from a particular motivation, but equally it makes a very broad sense in terms of what the research is. And your research was quite interesting, Stephanie. I mean, in DD 102, you were looking at photographs. You know, and sort of just being mindful again about how we research such complex things like this, what we're using, you know, what sort of sources of information and evidence are we getting to sort of get the sense of the world around us?
Well, that's right. And I mean, and I have colleagues who are not working on belonging, but working in other areas, are researching selfies and so on. So new technologies give you new forms of data. John Dixon's been doing very interesting work around Belfast, where he's actually put satellite trackers onto people to see their movements around a city, because where you belong in terms of place is so incredibly complex. You know, is it just your home, or is it a named place? And we very much look to heritage here. We start to say, you know, my mother, my grandmother, whoever came from here. Or then we get into types of place, you know, so quite a lot of people, again, if you think about retirement, quite a lot of people say, you know, I want to go to the mountains or the coast because that's the kind of place I feel that I belong. So in researching place, we can look at people's movements, as John has done. My own research, I've tended to work a lot with words, with interviews and focus groups, maybe media accounts, because those are very interesting from the social side, what ideas are being circulated, but also sometimes images like family photographs. And the point of all of this is always this point where the what you might call the intellectual side, the idea, hits the emotional, and you have something which matters not just in a sort of detached, logical, traditional academic way, but because it's right there in people's feelings and their lives. And so it takes us as well into how we understand people themselves. You know, do we need a psychoanalytic account to go deep inside them, or do we want to see them as social beings in some other sort of conceptualization? Which I could talk for a long time about, but probably you don't hugely want to hear.
Well, we will come back to some of these ideas because I think that there are certainly very interesting methods that we're all using, and so I'd like to come back to that at the end. But I'd just like to pick up Georgina on this point about, you know, things being sort of political as well as personal, like from Stephanie's perspective, because whilst we can sort of have this sense of belonging or not belonging, sometimes that is enforced on us, and there are consequences, legal consequences and moral consequences of belonging and not.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really interested when those kind of strong feelings of belonging that you talked about, when they become entangled with politics, and particularly in the case of Spain and Catalonia, when they become entangled with ideas of democracy. Because democracy kind of really works with a sense of belonging or a sense of not belonging. So if people belong to an organisation, a city, a region, a nation state, whatever kind of unit we want to think about, that's kind of based on a sense of belonging to that unit, and then people kind of take decisions collectively for that unit. But of course all that presupposes that there's a kind of a group of people that already exists, that we know who belongs and we know who doesn't belong. But of course it's not like that. And that's when it gets very controversial, that's when it gets very full of sort of conflict. And often these questions of who belongs, who doesn't belong, they're not decided by negotiation and dialogue, they're often decided by conflict. Now, in the case of Spain, we have the situation where a part of the country, or some people in a part of the country called Catalonia, want a referendum on independence, where that region of Spain wants to be independent. But how is that decided? What happened is that they had an illegal referendum because the Spanish constitution doesn't actually allow for a referendum on independence. And there are now 12 people, some of them elected representatives, some of them social movement activists, who are on trial in Spain, a liberal democratic country, for holding this referendum. And that's where you really get that kind of entanglement of the personal and the political. If these charges go ahead, they could face up to 17, 18 years in jail. Many of them have already been in jail for 1 year already. So these kind of decisions, they have real consequences, both personally and politically. So it's absolutely fascinating, and that's kind of where my sort of interest comes in.
So how are you going about researching that? It sounds like there's so many different things going on. You could take such a range of ways of approaching that.
Absolutely, and there's all kinds of sort of research going on there at the moment. So some people are researching it from a very legal point of view, because of course this is an ongoing trial that's currently sort of happening. And it's very interesting that the way the trial is being presented to the world, because of course those in favour of Catalan independence are presenting this as a struggle between the democratic Catalonia, the right to decide, the right to self-determination, against a Spanish state that is being portrayed by some as still having a dictatorial past. So in other words, you've got a struggle there, not just between law and politics, but also a struggle over the past itself and how that's interpreted, and two kind of different versions of democracy. So there's all kinds of different research going on. I've been doing interviews. That's kind of one sort of traditional sort of social science method that I've been using. But you kind of mentioned words. And one of the things that I'm thinking about doing is actually analysing the court proceedings from a kind of a discourse point of view, because the language used is fascinating. It's kind of being fought out with the same kind of language that was used about the Civil War, about the transition to democracy. The same kind of vocabulary is kind of being used there. And of course, you know, this trial is being televised, which again is quite unusual, but the Spanish state is very anxious to show to the watching world, kind of not just in Spain, but kind of the, you know, the world's media, that this trial is being conducted in accordance with the law in a fair and democratic manner. So there's an awful lot at stake here for both sides of the argument.
And an awful lot of presentation going on in terms of how this is being portrayed, as well as how it's being taken up by people as well. We asked people at home who get to decide in democracy. So let's see what you have to say. So 83%, this has shot up the whole population of a region. Nobody thinks that one group within that population, and 17% of the people affected by the decision. So what do you make of that, Georgina?
Fascinating, because actually it's never the whole population.
It's changing as we watch.
There are always exclusions, whether that's to do with age, whether that's to do with residence. So if, dare I mention it, if you look at the Brexit referendum, the whole population didn't decide that. The voting age was 18, so all those below 18 did not have a say in that. And it's the section of the population that was alive at that particular point in time. Now, that might sound a really odd thing to say. Of course, it's people who are alive who vote. But actually, there are studies that show that if you had held the referendum only 6 months afterwards, the vote could well have changed, because a proportion of the population would then have died at the older end. So, you know, it's absolutely fascinating. We always assume that the people are just there. They're just kind of out there and we just go and ask them. But each time there's a question, whether it's a general election or whether it's a referendum, that kind of population is created, the population that gets to decide that particular question. So in the case of Catalonia, what is the whole population of Catalonia? Is it people who are born there, people who live there, work there, pay their taxes? Should the rest of Spain have a say in that? Because, you know, if you go with it, well, you know, people take the decision if it affects them. Well, that's Spain, it could be other neighbouring countries, it could be people who kind of work in Spain but don't live there. It gets incredibly complex. And then if you link that to the feelings that you talked about, you know, feelings of belonging, when people start wrapping themselves in a flag, those are very, very powerful feelings. And one of the fascinating things, again, about sort of Catalonia, if you look at some of the footage from the referendum itself, is the assortment of flags on display. That, you know, a real range of different flags, all of which have kind of different meanings attached to them. So it's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm getting very excited about it. It's when you start talking.
It is. It's absolutely fine, because it's again this whole point of who belongs and who gets a say in all of this. Graham, you're looking at Indigenous people, and I imagine that a lot of what Georgina's saying here is really relevant to your side, because even though you're approaching things from a religious studies perspective, again, you're looking at this whole thing, but perhaps more broadly, because you're looking at Indigenous populations.
Yeah, so, well, in one sense, narrower, because it's particular populations who are usually, well, to define an indigenous population, the might be people who are within colonial or settler states who often don't have or haven't had historically the same rights as settlers, so they may not even be asked. And certainly weren't asked if other people could move in. So, but indigeneity is about people who have an affection not just for a place in general, but for specific land. They might turn the tables and think, sort of, we belong to the land rather than the land belonging to us. So then these issues of who gets to decide what happens in this place get very complex. So my approach as my particular way into this is, as you say, in religious studies, what interests me is how people use, quote, traditional rituals to evolve performance pieces that manifest their identities or their practices, their belonging in some sense. And often they're belonging to a larger than human community. So if we're going to ask about who gets to decide, well, do the fish in this river get to decide what happens to the river, as well as the people who want to fish, whether they are, in a particular case of my research, Sami people whose ancestors lived there for a long time, or Norwegian migrants, you might say, settlers, who've moved into that land. So I go to this festival, and I spend time observing, participating in, having a great time, really. I mean, let's be honest about it. It's what some anthropologists call deep hanging out. And I try and find out from the performers where their rituals, where their performance pieces are inspired. And I pay attention to, again, the words, where Maori bands, singers, performers, when they begin their pieces, they use traditional Maori greetings, from our river to your river, from our mountain to your river. And then they start speaking to the humans in that place. And then they begin their music, which is often, again, deeply rooted in traditional Maori land and human belonging and different relationships there. So, yeah, so similar issues, but sort of intensified by these problematic relationships between indigenous or Aboriginal populations and colonial settler and other nations.
So while all of you have a completely different discipline area and very, very different research perspectives, the one thing that is intrinsically in common is this whole focus on, discourse effectively, how things are being presented, the words, the language, the sort of style of doing things, and also that sort of brings to mind this whole idea about how belonging is to some extent about the practices, the rituals, the behaviours, the ways of either acting or presenting oneself to the world. But equally, we're all finding out very, very different things about this. So I just think it'd be interesting to sort of think maybe about those methods and those sort of ways we're doing things, and then what we're actually learning about. Because as you say, Georgina, there's so much there that you could look at. It's so interesting. How, as researchers then, are we making sort of decisions about what to focus on, what that knowledge is going to do, and what the purpose of it is really, when there is so much fascinating stuff here that is so meaningful?
I think sometimes at a very basic point, it depends on practicalities, what you can and can't get access to. That's sometimes about ability to travel, but it's sometimes also about access to kind of papers, social media, what you can, what is your material, what's actually there to analyse. But I think more importantly than that, and this should resonate with students hopefully, it's what question you want to ask.
Yeah.
What are the questions you want to ask? And then you try and map your methods onto the question, because not everything will help you to answer a specific question. So it's a question, what is it you're really wanting to ask, that I think then sort of helps to shape the methods that you use.
I'd say also that there's usually some kind of rupture, that so much of this is about what is taken for granted, and then there's the point where there's a collision, where two sets of taken for granted ideas crash against each other. And with the Indigenous examples, it's quite often, isn't it, because of some, well, I can think of New Zealand, there might be a decision to channel water from one particular river into one particular lake, which is a contravention in one set of terms about what belongs where. But if you're operating in the kind of the language of contracts and money, well, that's fine, why not, And obviously anything around nation and region and so on is, there'll be some traceable rupture, usually coming out of quite a few different things that people will spend a long time unravelling. And even my research, which sounds softer, it was prompted by the mismatch between the taken for grantedness of belonging to a place, which, if you think of that TV program, Who Do You Think You Are? We always sort of imagine this infinite heritage backwards, to our original place. And I always love the point that they say that North Americans spend enormous amounts of money sort of writing to Ireland asking for birth certificates because they're, wanting to come back to this originary place, which is Ireland, which, people in Ireland find that quite odd, not surprisingly. So you have this rupture between this notion of what I'd call a born and bred narrative going right back and the lives of most people now. I mean, I know very, very few people who live in the place that they were born, and even fewer whose own birthplace was a family birthplace, you know, where there was an identifiable heritage of grandparents and great-grandparents and family tombstones and so on. And so we hold on to the idea, and yet we're all moving around all the time and coming to live in places like Milton Keynes, where there are not very many people with a long history. And so the rupture I was interested in was between that assumption about how you belong and the circumstances of most people who, of course, want to belong, but need to somehow find a way of understanding their own lives in different terms. So it's a long answer to the point that I would say research is usually prompted by something that's already happened, some kind of clash point of ideas, of lifestyle, or the kind of thing that's labelled a political issue, perhaps.
We asked people at home about belonging or not belonging and what that's all about. And 50% said it was about a memory, which I think is really, really interesting. Very few people had said it's about a place. But let's take a look at some of the 3 places or communities that people say that they're proud, which I think is a very interesting part of that question, to belong to. So we've got church, humanity, OU, Wales, family, village life, British.
Daughter's school.
Daughter's school.
That's interesting. So, as I say, this born and bred narrative, which is about family as your connection to somewhere. Through people's own children, they often get a connection to place. A lot of the people I interviewed said, we may not have lived here very long, but our child was born here. That makes it a place of belonging for us.
And a lot of those are about communities of belonging rather than physical places or landscapes or however else, rivers, mountains, whatever that we invited people to think through. For some people, those are more important than they're somebody's more immediate than some human links. I mean, obviously, immediate human family may be very important to belonging, maybe a problem, but yeah, there's this interesting push and pull between place and peoplehood and those other things.
And what that also shows is something you mentioned at the start, which is about the multiplicity of it.
Yes.
You know, this sense you don't just have one identity, and that's the case in Spain and Catalonia. Most people kind of in Catalonia feel, or at least felt, simultaneously Catalan and Spanish, and also European to some extent. So, and there's no sort of conflict, or at least there wasn't until recently, between those different identities. So I think that's kind of also interesting from that sort of word cloud, really.
And very interesting, whilst we don't want to talk about Brexit, but a lot of these things are, you know, very reminiscent of things happening right now in terms of where we belong and our place in the world, both as individuals and as a nation.
Yeah, and you know what Stephanie said about the affective nature of it, that's why it matters so much. That's why people get so heated, because it is about feelings.
Let's take a quick trip to HJ and Damon. How are you both?
We're doing well. We're having quite an interesting conversation about things like languages and commonalities that we find, and somehow we could meet someone that we've never spoken to before, but yet we can find a link and a commonality, and we can feel like belong together with things like language. We're talking about the Welsh words that we know that actually kind of link us, like cwtch and dutty and scram as well. All things that we recognise and makes us feel connected or belonging with each other as well, which is really interesting.
Yeah, Graham was saying that it's mostly about communities, and some people are saying they do identify with the sort of area that they're from, their town that they're from, but actually they don't like where they come from, and if they could get out and go somewhere else and identify someplace else. So it's not necessarily about where their roots are, it's more about where they would want to be, where they would want to belong, I guess.
Again, this thing of being taken up and you know, created by people in terms of their identity, isn't it? Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that stimulating discussion. It's all we've got time for now, but we're going to show a couple of videos before our next session. Victoria Cooper is going to talk about the criminalisation of homeless people and the impact of austerity on homelessness, and she will be a guest in our next session with Sean Cordell, where we will be talking about inequality. So join me for that next session in just a few minutes.